This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for July 21st, 2022. And I want to go over this briefing. It's from July 20th, 2022 from the U.S. Department of Defense. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Army General Mark Milley, hold a press conference. And I just want to show you how listening to these briefings, just by listening to these briefings, you can tell that things are not going all that well for U.S. plans in Ukraine, this proxy war that the U.S. is waging against Russia through Ukraine. So this is how they open the briefing. Opening statement by both Secretary Austin and General Milley. Secretary Austin says the security assistance that we are rushing to Ukraine is making a real difference in real time, and everyone in the contact group has been inspired by the courage of the Ukrainian people and the skill of the Ukrainian military. And he never mentions anything specific that can qualify this claim that all of this assistance is making a real difference in real time anywhere on the battlefield. Ukraine is retreating. They're retreating out of the Donbass region. They lost several Donetsk and Lysychansk. They are trying to hold the defense line from Seversk to Bakhmut and also Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Once these areas are taken, Russia will have more or less secured the Donbass region. Secretary Austin also says Ukrainian forces are now using long-range rocket systems to great effect, including HIMARS provided by the United States and other systems from other allies and partners. Ukraine's defenders are pushing hard to halt Russia's advances in the Donbass. He didn't say that they are halting Russia's advances. He says they're pushing hard to halt Russia's advances in the Donbass because they haven't. They're retreating. So just by listening to what he's saying and how he's wording it, he has no good news for anyone in the Western media who come to these briefings, who then go off and write their articles about the situation in Ukraine. Secretary Austin also says the international community has also worked hard to provide Ukraine with better coastal defense capabilities, and that directly contributed to Ukraine's victory on Snake Island, and it has helped prevent a Russian landing in Odessa. And these are two absolute falsehoods. Snake Island has no strategic or tactical value at all. It is a rock in the middle of the Black Sea. It's too small to put anything of any significance on. It just makes whoever is stationed there a sitting target, and it is of such little value that Ukraine had less than 100 soldiers protecting it in the first place when this whole conflict began. It fell without any fighting at all. So that is not some major victory for Ukraine. Ukraine does not have a permanent presence on Snake Island right now. Neither side does. If Ukraine were to put anything on the island, Russia would destroy it. This idea that this is preventing a Russian landing in Odessa is also ridiculous. Another falsehood. Russia's military, since this all began, well, in the beginning, they came in and they attacked multiple points all at one time. That was the opening phase. And what they were trying to do was collapse Ukrainian fighting everywhere possible without having to actually fight, to just have them crack and flee or surrender. That was the purpose of that. But after that, what Russia has done is they have picked a primary objective, they focus on it, and then when that is done, the forces involved go to the next primary objective. So after that initial phase, the main focus was on Mariupol. Once Mariupol was taken, the focus shifted to the Donbass region, northern Donbass to be specific. And that is where Russian forces are still focused. They're going to be focused there for quite a while. When that is done, they will pick another area to focus. It could be Kharkov, a city in northeast Ukraine. It could be Nikolaev, near Kherson, because they have to take Nikolaev before they take Odessa. The idea that Russia is going to put a landing force on the beaches of Odessa to try to take Odessa with their forces completely isolated, in Ukrainian-held territory is ridiculous. They would have to resupply them entirely by sea or by air. It would be a very precarious and dangerous position to hold, and I don't think that they would be able to hold it. They will take Odessa when Russian forces are in total ready to focus on just taking Odessa. So why is U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin making things up to try to make it look like Ukraine is doing better than it is? Because they have nothing of substance to show for all of this assistance, the involvement of the West in general in Ukraine. They have nothing to show for. That's why they have to depend on these fictions. During the briefing, Secretary Austin also notes that various members of this contact group, so that this contact group that he's referring to in this briefing is a group of nations, Western nations, that get together once a month, and they talk about all the weapons and support they're going to pledge to Ukraine, and then over the next month they implement it. Then they have another meeting. Then after these meetings, they will have a briefing like this usually. So he's talking about how these partners with the US, they're going to provide spare parts, they're going to help repair damaged equipment, which means the Ukrainians, and as I've said and others have pointed out, you're giving Ukraine all of these weapon systems they've never used before. So they need to learn how to operate them. They also need to learn how to maintain them. They need spare parts to perform maintenance, and in many cases they don't know how to. So it has to be sent back to wherever it came from, or maybe to neighboring Poland, get repaired there by experts from across Europe and from the United States, and then shipped back to the front line. This is a very inefficient way of doing things, but it's the only thing that Ukraine can do, because all of the equipment that they were familiar with, that they knew how to repair, could repair in workshops across Ukraine, all of that equipment is mostly gone. And also mostly gone are the repair shops they were carrying out this maintenance in. Russia has been attacking those as well. So it's another one of these aspects of this conflict that put Ukraine at an extreme disadvantage. And sending these weapon systems back and forth like that to be maintained is going to strain Ukraine's logistics even further than they already are. Secretary Austin also talks about Norway supplying these anti-air missiles. These missiles, and I've talked about this before, these are meant to replace the S-300 systems that Ukraine had been using. The S-300 system, even though Ukraine's version, those were quite old, they were still extremely capable, better than almost everything that NATO has at its disposal. The system that it's being replaced with from Norway has a shorter range, fewer capabilities, so they have no choice. They cannot repair the S-300s. They don't have spare parts. They can't build new ones, and they cannot find replacements for the missiles the S-300 system fires. So they have to depend on systems coming from across the West. Even if they're inferior, I guess it's better than nothing. And also, again, I talk a lot about the HIMARS, these multiple launch rocket systems from the US, because everyone in the US, across the Western media and from the Pentagon, that's all they talk about are the HIMARS. This is the next wonder weapon that is supposed to change the tide of this conflict. But as you see, they have no good news to report on that either. So he's talking about that. He says Ukraine has 12, and they're going to send another 4. So that'll be a total of 16 HIMARS, but as I pointed out, Russia has destroyed at least 3 of these HIMARS systems. When you're following pro-Ukrainian sources, tracking the alleged strikes that these HIMARS are carrying out, they do a handful a week. This is versus precision strikes carried out by Russia every single day. So even though Ukraine now has the ability to carry out precision strikes, they're in small numbers versus Russia's ability to carry out many times more precision strikes. So if precision strikes could help you win a war, Russia is going to win the war much sooner than Ukraine. And then U.S. General Mark Milley, he starts talking, and this is what he says. He says, today is 5 months since Russia launched its illegal invasion. While the Russians have achieved some incremental tactical success in the Donbass, over the last several weeks and actually months, they have failed to achieve their strategic and operational objectives. A capable and defiant people of Ukraine, their capital still stands, their army still fights, and their people are more determined now than ever to preserve their democracy. And again, just like Secretary Austin, General Milley is just making things up because he has nothing of substance to present at this briefing. When you really actually think about it, Russia has achieved many things. I mean, incremental tactical success. I don't think so. I think they've established a land bridge from Crimea to the Donbass region and then to the borders of the Russian Federation. I think they've taken Mariupol and actually several major port cities on the coast, all except for Odessa, basically. I think they've secured all of Lugansk, and now they're working to secure all of Donetsk. I think that's quite a bit that they've achieved. And so why is General Milley, why is he trying to play it down? General Milley then goes on to say, collectively, we cannot allow the strong to conquer the weak, nor tolerate the idea that might makes right, which when you think about it, this is what defines the collective West's foreign policy. He's saying this as the US illegally occupies eastern Syria. So who is he trying to kid? And again, it's one of these things that when you really think about it, you could see how far off from reality the United States is, even at the highest levels of US government. And then General Milley says, in regards to the HIMARS, he says, as of today, we have transferred 12 HIMARS to Ukraine. This is part of more than 20 the United States and our allies have committed. Trained also are 200 Ukrainians on the HIMARS, and that training continues with many more. And we've transferred, as the Secretary indicated, hundreds of GMLR munitions. These are the rockets with an 80-kilometer range that the US is sending along with the HIMARS. Now, after the opening statements, the media starts asking questions. So one of the questions was about sustainment and logistics. Secretary Austin responds with mostly empty rhetoric. Oh, you know, we're working with our partners. We're going to solve this. We're working on all of these different things. We know it's important. But in reality, the problem that Ukraine faces, especially in terms of logistics and sustainment, is that they're getting all of these different weapon systems from all across the West. Older systems, newer systems, it's a mix of everything. For example, they're getting all types of guns from across Europe, artillery, Europe and the United States, also Australia and Canada. They all fire 155 millimeter rounds, but the thing is, each one of these systems all have unique characteristics that require specific training just for them and also specific maintenance in order to keep them operating on the battlefield. And so what this does is it creates a logistical nightmare for Ukraine. It also creates a nightmare trying to train these forces and for these forces to coordinate on the battlefield. They're at an obvious disadvantage, and this is a disadvantage that the US and its allies have no way of addressing. Russia's equipment is standardized across the entire military. Their artillery, their multiple launch rocket systems, their aircraft, everything is standardized. They're not using a mix of equipment from all different countries from around the world. It's all equipment that they started the conflict off with, that their military has been using for years and years, that they're extremely familiar with, not only operating on the battlefield, but also repairing and getting it back onto the battlefield. This is a massive disadvantage for Ukraine that cannot be addressed. And then another question toward General Milley. They're asking him what's his assessment of what's going on in the Donbass region. So he gives this extremely long-winded answer. Doesn't really answer the question, to be honest with you. But he says, the invasion begins 24th February, and then about mid-April, April 16th, in fact, the Russians decide they're going to go ahead and shift their war aims and come out of Kiev lines of advance and mass their forces down to the vicinity of the Donbass. But actually, Russian President Vladimir Putin said at the very beginning That's the very day these operations began, that the primary objective was secure the Donbass, demilitarize, denazify Ukraine. Those were the three objectives given for this military operation. It was not to seize Kiev. That was never a stated objective of Russia. I have yet to see anyone point out where Russia said, yes, we're going to take Kiev. That was never an objective. It was always to secure the Donbass region. This is what they are in the middle of doing right now. So already he's building this narrative on a foundation of fantasy. And he then goes on and says, so for the last 90 days, the Russians have massed their ground maneuver forces in that region, and the Ukrainians have fought a very effective mobile defense in depth, an area of defense in depth anchored on very strong points in urban and village areas. And they have fought the Russians very effectively. So for 90 days, the Russian advances have amounted to maybe 6 to 10 miles, something of that range. It's not very much. It's very intense, a lot of violence, tens of thousands of artillery rounds every 24-hour period, lots of casualties on both sides, lots of destruction of villages and so on. But in terms of actual ground gain, very, very little by the Russians relative to all of Ukraine. Over the last 7 to 8 years, Ukraine has built extensive defenses all across the Donbass, the whole line of contact between Ukrainian forces and the separatist forces of Donbass. They have multiple layers of fortified lines. They interlock. They have overlapping areas of fire. They have bunkers, concrete tunnels, everything you could imagine built up over the last 7 to 8 years. If they cannot stop Russia there at these lines, if Russia continues moving, however slowly, over these lines, they're not going to be able to stop Russia anywhere else. This is where the absolute best Ukrainian defenses are, their best trained troops, all of their best equipment is there. If they cannot stop Russia there with 7 to 8 years of fortifications built up in front of the Russian force, they're not going to be able to stop Russia once they cross this line of defense. That's what General Milley's actually trying to tell you. And then he says, as you know, the Ukrainians conducted a controlled, deliberate, planned withdrawal from Severodonetsk. They conducted a rearward passage of lines and conducted a rear river crossing, and they set up a new line generally to the west of Severodonetsk. And they are continuing significant resistance, which is just a fancy way of saying they retreated. There was nothing planned about it. As a matter of fact, they all said that they weren't going to withdraw, and then they were forced to because their forces were being decimated. And then he says, in addition to that, in the Russian occupied areas, you have significant resistance behind Russian lines, so to speak. So the Russians are challenged not only to their front with the Ukrainian conventional forces, but they're also challenged in their rear areas. Their rear areas are not secure for sure, and the Ukrainians have very effective resistance networks set up. No, they don't. They are carrying out attacks behind Russian lines. There's no doubt about that. They're carrying terrorist attacks out against, collaborators, Russian-speaking Ukrainians who have been tormented for the last 7 to 8 years by Ukrainian forces, nationalist forces, Nazis essentially, who are working with the Russians so that they can get their lives back to normal as soon as possible. But that is not what General Milley is describing. He's describing some insurgency that simply doesn't exist, and I haven't heard either side claim that it does. And so he concludes this assessment of the Donbass fighting by saying, so the bottom line is the cost is very high, the gains are very low, there is a grinding war of attrition that is occurring in the Lugansk Donbass region, Lugansk Donetsk, and then they say it's not auditable. And to answer your question about, is the Donbass lost? No, it's not lost yet. General Milley's also asked about the HIMARS. A lot of questions revolve around the HIMARS, this wonder weapon that are supposed to change the war. And you know what? He says that it's not really the number of launchers that's important, it's the amount of ammunition. And this is something that even the Western media has admitted for months now, actually. the West does not have a large supply of ammunition to transfer over to Ukraine, not nearly what they need to actually win this war. And General Milley is saying that, they have to be very careful about how they use the rockets that the HIMARS launches. And then Secretary Austin, again, in regards to the HIMARS, this is what he says. The HIMARS alone will not change or win or lose a fight, but it's the integration of a number of capabilities that we have provided and are looking at providing down the road. And this is exactly what I've been saying almost every single update. So this is something that people have accused me of being a Russian propagandist for saying, and this is the US Secretary of Defense saying exactly the same thing. All of these weapons that the US is sending to Ukraine, they were designed under the assumption that they'd be used as part of a combined arms force, that the US would have established air superiority over the battlefield, that they would have heavy armored units on the battlefield much further ahead of the HIMARS and protecting their front, but also their flanks, and that the HIMARS would be able to operate more or less with impunity way in the rear. But that's not what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine has no air force to speak of. They cannot even feed or resupply their infantry. Their armored forces are more or less completely depleted. They're asking nations in Europe to send them more tanks and armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. So when the HIMARS goes out on the battlefield, it's going out on a battlefield not as part of a much wider combined arms effort. It's really kind of going out there by itself with a couple of other units that are supporting it specifically. But the remnants of Ukraine's military right now on the battlefield, it does not represent a combined arms force acting cohesively as one fighting force. And this puts Ukraine at a serious disadvantage, not just with the HIMARS, but with any other wonder weapon the US and its allies sends Ukraine. And it was the same exact story for the M777. You go watch a video of M777s being used by US forces in Afghanistan, and you see them in these fire bases that are built up. They never move these guns. They sit there all day firing, and they're supporting US forces way out in the field. And they know that the Taliban or whoever else they're fighting there in Afghanistan, they know that they don't have long-range weapons to threaten the M777. That simply is not the case in Ukraine. Russia has been hunting down the M777s and destroying them systematically, and now they've started doing the same thing with the HIMARS. There were also questions about this story, I think, is gaining traction, the U.S. preparing to train Ukrainian pilots. I don't think that there's any solid plan to do this yet, but there's a lot of talk about it. There were people in the U.S. Congress proposing this idea, and now the media is asking Secretary Austin and General Milley about this. And they're talking about training Ukrainian pilots to fly, say, F-16s or F-15 warplanes sent to Ukraine. Now, the problem is Ukraine already had an air force. In February 2022, they had an air force. Russia attacked their airfields, destroyed many of them on the ground, and what few survived and were flying sorties have been systematically shot down by Russia's very formidable air defenses. And the exact same thing is going to happen if and when the US and its allies start sending Western warplanes. It also will take months and months to train pilots, even skilled pilots, to use these systems effectively. Like they might be able to take off and fly a mission, but to do it effectively so that they can come back and do it again and actually accomplish something on the battlefield, that will take months and months of training. What it is the next wonder weapon story taking shape as the West starts to come to grips with the reality surrounding the HIMARS. General Milley said the bottom line is that Ukraine is losing more than it's receiving in aid from the West. And in terms of manpower, they mentioned the UK training Ukrainian forces. They're going to train 10,000 every 4 months. Ukraine loses more than twice that in the same amount of time. Not just that, but there are certain roles that you need filled with leaders, non-commissioned officers, sergeants and above, commissioned officers. These are the soldiers on the battlefield that lead men into battle, that organize forces, coordinate them on the battlefield, that make combined arms warfare possible. When they are gone, it takes years to replace them. You cannot replace them in 4 months. That is impossible. So what you're going to end up with is perhaps a force large enough to constitute a brigade, when they're trying to stand up a new brigade for Ukraine. And they might have the supplies, the equipment, and the weapons for a full brigade, but you will not have the leadership necessary to lead that brigade effectively into combat. And it's for all of these reasons that Russia continues to advance on the battlefield, especially in an area of Ukraine that is extremely well defended, and yet Russia continues advancing. And like I said, if they couldn't stop Russia, say at the beginning of this, with a military that was built up over the course of 8 years, hiding behind defenses that were built up over the same amount of time, if they could not stop Russia then, with their forces now depleted the way they are, their equipment disappearing off of the battlefield the way that it is, there's no way that they're going to stop them now. And there really is nothing the West can do to turn this around. Why does the West continue doing this? Is it really to bleed Russia, or is it to, in a very cynical way, continue cashing in on this disaster as the West encourages Ukraine to destroy itself in this senseless attempt to fight back against Russia? And I notice in the comment sections, a lot of people will say, well, what is Ukraine supposed to do? Are they supposed to just surrender their sovereignty to Russia? And the answer is, they have no sovereignty to surrender. In 2014, after the United States overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, Ukraine's sovereignty ceased to exist. And what existed from that point onward to today is a client regime installed into power by the US and its allies. It serves their interests, not the Ukrainian people's interests, obviously. They are destroying Ukraine. They are getting the Ukrainian people killed. They are gutting their economy in ways that will take decades to fix. They're not serving Ukrainian interests. They're serving US interests, European Union interests, British interests, and they're doing it at the cost of the Ukrainian people. So yes, they should surrender that to the Russians, and then maybe they have a chance of actually getting a sovereign country back as a result. It couldn't be a worse prospect than they face right now. So that does it for this update. I'll continue keeping an eye on this. I like to do updates every time the Pentagon releases a transcript. They just released this one today, even though the briefing was yesterday. I'll keep an eye on all of this. If you thought this update was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do. It really does help the channel grow. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below and click on show more and look at all of those links. Those are places you can find my work elsewhere. I'm on Telegram. It's a replacement for Twitter and Facebook, which I have been kicked off of. I do updates several times a day on Telegram. There's also Odyssey and Rumble, where all of my YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to. It could take a day or two for a new video to be updated there, but that's where they go. And if for any reason I'm kicked off of YouTube, I am going to still be publishing new videos on Odyssey and Rumble. And I've also started publishing short, very short videos on Telegram, exclusively on Telegram. So find and follow my work there. In the video description, again, is the link to this briefing so you can read the whole thing or watch the video if you'd like. There's also ways you can help support my work listed in the video description below. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and through PayPal. This is what allows me to continue doing this work and to do it as often as I do. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much, whether it's month-to-month donations or one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share this work with other people. I appreciate all of that help. That's what makes this possible. Thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.